Some people will tell you that hell is a place of fire and brimstone, a kingdom of shadows somewhere far beneath our feet, ruled by a devil with horns and a pitchfork. They speak of it in sermons on Sunday mornings, in hushed and fearful tones, a divine punishment waiting for the wicked in the afterlife. But I am here to tell you, as a woman who has now seen 73 years come and go on this earth, that they are only half right. Hell is real, but it is not some distant, fiery pit. Hell can be a two-story house at the end of a dusty road in the mountains, with white paint peeling from the porch rails like sunburnt skin. And the devil, well, the devil can have a human face. Sometimes, it's the face you see every morning across the breakfast table. Sometimes, it is the face of the person you are supposed to trust the most in all the world. My name is Abigail, and this is my story. It's not an easy one to tell, and it's not an easy one to hear. But it is the truth. And I've learned that the only way to rob the devil of his power is to drag his secrets out into the light. Before the silence, my life was a song. It didn't begin in the shadows. It began in the warm, dappled light of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. Our little house was tucked into a hollow, a small valley nestled between two slumbering green giants. And the air always smelled of damp earth, sweet pine, and my mother's baking. My mother, Eleanor, was the song. She was the melody and the harmony of our home. It wasn't that she was a great singer, not the kind who'd stand up and lead the choir at the First Baptist Church. Her music was quieter, more constant. It was in the gentle hum that vibrated in her chest while she kneaded dough for bread, her hands moving with a practiced, loving rhythm. It was in the soft, steady click-clack of her knitting needles on cold evenings as she worked wool into sweaters and socks to keep the mountain chill at bay. It was in the patient, melodious tone of her voice when she would read to me from her worn-out book of poems by the light of a kerosene lamp. Her hands were never still. They were always creating something from what little we had, a vibrant quilt from scraps of old dresses, a nourishing supper from the beans and potatoes pulled from our garden. A fortress of safety for me within our four walls. She believed in two things with the entirety of her soul: the unending grace of her God and the liberating power of an education. Abigail, she'd say to me, her fingers smelling faintly of flower and rosemary, tucking a stray piece of my brown hair behind my ear. Listen to me now. In this life, people can take almost anything from you. They can take your home, they can take your money, they can even try to take your good name for a time. But what you learn, Abby, what you put right here inside this head of yours, that is the one thing that nobody on God's green earth can ever take away from you. She herself had only finished the 8th grade, which was common enough for girls in those hills back in her day. But she was the most intelligent woman I ever knew. She read every book she could borrow, her mind a hungry traveler journeying to lands she would never see with her own eyes. She taught me my letters and numbers at the kitchen table before I was old enough to set foot in the one-room schoolhouse down the road. For her, learning wasn't just about getting a good job or making a better life. It was about freedom, the absolute, unshakable freedom to have your own thoughts, to see the world beyond the confines of our hollow, to be your own person, whole and complete. I see it so clearly now. She wasn't just teaching me to read. She was handing me a compass and drawing me a map for a perilous journey she somehow knew I would have to take one day. My father, Samuel, was a different sort of person altogether. To the folks in town, he was a pillar of the community, a man's man. He was a coal miner, one of the brave souls who descended into the dark belly of the earth each dawn and emerged at dusk. His face and clothes covered in a fine black dust that seemed to have seeped into the very lines of his skin. He was respected for it. It was brutal, dangerous, honest work. The kind of work that broke a man's body, but put food on his family's table. He was a man of very few words, his presence large and silent in our small home. His hands, thick and heavily calloused from years of swinging a pickaxe and hauling timber, were not gentle like my mother's. They were tools, built for breaking rock and wrestling with the earth, not for caressing a child's cheek or holding a book. I believe he loved my mother as much as he was capable of loving anything. He loved her in his own quiet, stoic, and fiercely possessive way. I would often see him watching her from his armchair by the fire as she moved about the kitchen, a look in his eyes that I was too young to decipher then. It was a mixture of pride and something else. Something darker that I would later come to understand as ownership. He saw her as his light, the one pure and beautiful thing in a life defined by darkness, dust, and backbreaking labor. I, in turn, was simply an extension of her, a moon reflecting her sun. As long as she was there, his world was in order. The planets of his life revolved around her gravity. And I was safe under the warm umbrella of her love. The music began to fade in the spring of my 15th year. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. It was a cough, a small, dry, rattling sound that Mother would try to hide behind her hand, as if embarrassed by the betrayal of her own body. Then came the weariness, a profound exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. The way she would have to sit down on the stairs and catch her breath after simply carrying a basket of laundry up from the washroom. The doctor from the next town over, a grim-faced man named Dr. Abrams, eventually came in his dusty black Ford, his leather bag smelling of antiseptic and bad news. He and my father spoke in low, serious tones on the front porch. I watched them through the parlor window, trying to read their faces. The word he used, the word that hung in the air like a death knell, was tuberculosis. In those days, in those mountains, it was a death sentence whispered in the wind. We did what we could, which was heartbreakingly little. We moved her bed into the front parlor, the sunniest room in the house, hoping the light could somehow fight the darkness growing in her lungs. I quit school to care for her full-time. That decision, I think, broke her heart more than the sickness itself. "No, Abby, no," she whispered, her breath shallow and labored. "Your books, don't you leave your books. Promise me." I promised her I wouldn't, that I'd read to her instead, that we would do her learning together. And so I did. For months that stretched from a cool spring into a hot, heavy summer, I sat by her side. I read her poetry, my history lessons, articles from the newspaper, anything to keep her mind, and mine, from the grim reality that was closing in on us like a fog. Her body grew terrifyingly frail, a pale shadow of the vibrant woman she had been, but her spirit, her light, fought on. She would grip my hand, her hold surprisingly strong, and make me repeat the promises she needed to hear. "Promise me you'll be strong, Abigail. Stronger than you think you are. Promise me you'll never let anyone, not ever, put out your light. You get out of this hollow one day. You go see the world for me." I promised, my hot tears falling onto her thin, cool hands. I was promising a future I couldn't possibly imagine to a mother who was slowly, inexorably, leaving me behind. The song stopped for good on a cold night in late October. The air was thick with the coming winter, and a mournful wind howled around the corners of the house like a lonesome animal. She died peacefully, they said, and I suppose she did. Her last breath was not a gasp or a struggle, but a quiet, gentle sigh, as if she were finally letting go of a great and terrible burden. The very moment she was gone, a silence fell over the house. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a profound, hollow, aching void where her humming, her laughter, her soft footsteps, her very presence used to be. The silence was louder than any noise I had ever heard. My father sat in his armchair, not moving, not speaking, just staring at the empty bed where his wife had been. He didn't cry. He just sat there, a statue carved from grief, as the women from the church came in their dark dresses to wash and prepare her body for the wake. They laid her out in a simple pine coffin in the parlor, dressed in her best Sunday dress. The scent of lilies and carnations, brought by the steady stream of neighbors, filled the air, a sweet, cloying smell that to this day makes my stomach churn with a phantom grief. For 2 days, our little house was full of people. They came with casseroles and baked hams. They patted my shoulder and murmured empty words like, "She's with the Lord now," and "She was such a good woman." They spoke to my father, who would only nod, his eyes dark and unreadable. A stormy sea I could not navigate. I felt like a ghost, watching a play about someone else's life. None of it felt real. The body in the parlor looked like my mother, but it was just a shell. The music was gone forever. And in the crushing silence she left behind, something terrible and ugly was beginning to stir. I didn't know it then, standing there in my black dress, numb and lost. But as our friends and neighbors mourned the passing of a mountain angel, I was about to be formally introduced to the devil. And he was sitting right there in my father's armchair, waiting for the guests to leave. The last of the mourners finally shuffled out into the cold October night, their hushed condolences and the scent of their pity clinging to the air. The heavy oak door clicked shut and the bolt slid home. The sound echoed in the sudden, profound emptiness of the house. It was just the three of us then. My father, me, and the silent, still body of my mother in the parlor. The quiet that descended was different from the one that had followed her death. This was a heavy, watchful silence, thick with unspoken things. My hands submerged in a sink of greasy dishwater, numbly washing the stacks of plates and cups left by our well-meaning neighbors. It was a task, something to do, a way to keep my hands busy and my mind from shattering into 1,000 pieces. I could feel my father's presence in the other room, a dark, brooding weight in his armchair. Then, I heard his heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. He walked into the kitchen, and the air grew colder. He smelled sharply of whiskey, the sour, medicinal scent clinging to him like a second skin. He had been drinking steadily, almost silently, since the moment she died, but this was different. I could feel it. His eyes, which had been clouded with a distant grief, now held a terrifying glint, a focused, predatory intensity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up on end. He did not speak to me. He walked past me to the hook by the back door where my mother's old housecoat always hung. It was a faded blue chenille, worn soft and thin with years of use. It was her comfort, the garment she slipped on first thing in the morning and on chilly evenings. It smelled of her, of soap and wood smoke and a faint trace of vanilla. He took it down from the hook and held it out to me.
"Put it on," he said.
His voice was not his own. It was a low, gravelly rasp, thick with whiskey and something else I could not name. I stared at him, my hands frozen in the water. The command did not make sense.
"What?"
"Papa, why would I do that?" "Do not you ask me why," he growled, the words slurring together into a low, dangerous threat. "You do as I say. Put the damn thing on." A cold dread, slick and oily, began to creep up my spine from the base of my feet. I took a step back, shaking my head, my wet hands dripping onto the linoleum floor. "I do not want to. That is Mama's." In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between us. His hand, that big, calloused coal miner's hand, shot out and clamped down on my upper arm. His grip was like a band of iron. The shock of it, the sudden, brutal force, stole my breath. "Your mother is gone," he hissed. His face, so close to mine that I was enveloped in the foul cloud of his breath. "This house needs a woman. You are the woman of the house now. You will take her place. In all things." The words swirled in my head, meaningless and monstrous. Take her place? What could he possibly mean? The dread turned to sheer terror as the implication, the unspeakable horror of what he was saying, began to dawn. He shook me then, a sharp, violent rattle, the blue housecoat still dangling from his other hand like a captured flag.
"Now,
you put this on. And from this day forward, when I speak to you, you will answer to her name. Do you understand me, Eleanor?" Hearing him call me by my mother's name was like a physical blow. It was a violation, a desecration of the most sacred memory I had.
It was a theft."
"No," I whispered, the defiance a tiny, flickering candle in the hurricane of my fear. Tears I did not know I had been holding back finally broke free, streaming down my hot cheeks. "My name is Abigail." His face, already a mask of grief and alcohol, contorted into a new and terrible shape. It was a spasm of pure rage, a rawness I had never witnessed in him before. With a guttural roar, he threw the house goat onto the floor, and his open hand swung through the air, striking me across the face. The force of the blow was stunning. It snapped my head to the side and sent me stumbling backward against the kitchen counter, the back of my head cracking hard against the wood. The room spun. A kaleidoscope of familiar objects suddenly made strange and threatening. The sharp, metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. He stood over me, his broad chest heaving, his eyes wild. "Her name," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the small kitchen, "is the only name I will call you by. You will be her for me. You will cook for me like she did. You will clean this house like she did. And you will warm my bed like she did." That was it. That was the moment the floor of my world did not just crack, but fell away entirely, plunging me into that hell I spoke of. The unspeakable had been spoken. The final, sacred boundary between a father and a daughter had been utterly obliterated, and he was dragging me across the ruins with him. I was frozen, paralyzed not just by fear, but by a profound, soul-shattering disbelief. This was my father, my protector, the man my mother had loved and served, the man who was meant to guide me through my grief, not become the source of a new and infinitely more terrible one. That night was the beginning of the long, unending nightmare. He forced me into my mother's bedroom, into her bed. What he did to me that night, and on so many nights that followed, are things I have spent a lifetime trying to bury. He took from me the one thing a child believes is inviolable, her innocence. And he did it while his wife, my mother, the woman he claimed to be mourning, lay cold and still in her coffin in the very next room. The next morning, hours before the funeral was to begin, he stormed into my bedroom. I watched from the doorway, a silent, terrified wraith wrapped in that hated blue chenille housecoat he had forced me into. He tore open my closet and my dresser drawers. He took all of my clothes, my simple girlish dresses, my school blouses. He took my books, the few treasures I had, including the worn copy of Little Women my mother had given me for my 13th birthday. He piled everything into his arms and carried it out to the rusty burned barrel behind the house. He doused the pile with kerosene and struck a match. I stood at the back window and watched the bright, hungry flames consume the very fabric of who I was. Abigail was burning, and as the greasy black smoke rose into the cold morning air, I knew he was trying to erase every last trace of her from the face of the earth. At the funeral, I stood beside him at the graveside, a hollowed-out doll in one of my mother's black dresses. It hung loosely on my 15-year-old frame, a constant, scratchy reminder of the skin I was now forced to wear. The pity in people's eyes was almost unbearable. "Poor child," I heard one woman from the church whisper to another. "She misses her mama so terribly. She's taken to wearing her clothes. Ignacio says she simply will not take them off." He had done it. He had created the perfect, tragic lie, a mask of a daughter's unbearable grief to hide his monstrous secret. I stood there, a silent ghost in another woman's clothes, being called another woman's name. My own identity a pile of smoldering ash behind my house. The devil had not just shown his face. He had stolen mine and replaced it with a mask of the dead to wear among the living. And as they lowered my mother's casket into the cold, dark earth, I felt with a chilling certainty that they were burying me right alongside her. The years that followed the funeral were not lived day by day, but were endured breath by breath. They folded into one another, a long, seamless stretch of gray, like a West Virginia sky heavy with snow. Our house, the house that my mother's love had built into a sanctuary, became my prison. The walls that had once echoed with her humming now seemed to press inward, suffocating me. The windows that had let in the morning sun now only showed me a world I could no longer touch. My father, Samuel, was no longer my father. He was my warden, and his vigilance was absolute. He sealed me off from the outside world with a chilling and methodical efficiency. School, of course, was out of the question. My education, the one thing my mother had prayed for me to have, the key she believed would unlock my freedom, was over. He informed the school that my grief was too profound, that I was too fragile to face my classmates. He told the few neighbors who were bold enough to ask that I preferred to stay home, that I found comfort in keeping my mother's memory alive by tending to her house, just as she always had. It was yet another of his masterful, insidious lies, woven so carefully into the fabric of our small town's understanding of sorrow that no one thought to pull at the thread.
How could they?
They saw a broken man, and they saw what they believed was a devoted, heartbroken daughter. My days fell into a rigid, suffocating routine, a liturgy of chores performed by a ghost. I would rise before the sun, my body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. I would dress in one of my mother's faded house dresses, the worn cotton always feeling like a costume, a stranger's skin against my own. Then the performance would begin. I cooked his meals on my mother's stove, my hands automatically mimicking the motions I had learned at her side. But the food I made, the same simple, hearty Appalachian fare, tasted of nothing but ash and resentment in my mouth. I cleaned the house, scrubbing floors until my knees were raw, trying to scour away a filth that was not in the wood, but inside of me. I tended her garden in the summer, my hands plunged into the cool earth, pulling weeds with a vicious, silent anger. He would sit in his armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and his eyes would follow my every move. There was a sick, quiet satisfaction on his face as he watched me become her. He never called me Abigail again. Not once. In his mind, in our home, I was Eleanor. His Eleanor. A younger, more pliable version he could mold and control completely. The nights were the worst. They were a separate country of terror. His drinking, once a weekend habit, became a nightly, non-negotiable ritual. Unpredictable storm. Sometimes it was a storm of violent, senseless rage. A dish not washed to his liking. A meal that was not hot enough. A word I said that he did not approve of. Any of these could result in a slap, a shove, or being locked in the root cellar for hours. Other times, it was a storm of maudlin, weeping self-pity. He would sit at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, crying into his glass about how much he missed her, how lonely he was without his Eleanor. He'd look at me, dressed in her clothes, and say, "You look so much like her tonight, Eleanor. It is a great comfort to a broken man." Those nights, in some ways, were even more disturbing. They were a terrifying glimpse into the twisted, broken machinery of his mind, a mind that had cannibalized his own daughter, remade me into a living ghost to soothe his own selfish pain. And then there were the other nights. What stopped me? It was a promise made to a dying woman in a sunlit room. "Promise me you'll be strong, Abigail. Promise me you'll never let anyone put out your light." The one part of me he could not violate. I would lie in my bed, rigid in the darkness, and I would repeat her words to myself like a prayer. And then I would make another promise, a silent, enduring and defiant, as Jo March, fiercely independent. This inner world was my only true escape, the only place where I was still, and would always be, Abigail. On the outside, I was a ghost. On the rare occasions we had to go into town for supplies, he kept me close to his side, his hand on the small of my back, a possessive brand that no one else could see. The townspeople would look at me with that same sad, suffocating pity. "Such a devoted daughter," they'd say to him, shaking his hand. "A blessing to you in your time of sorrow, Samuel." They saw a pale, silent girl in old-fashioned clothes, her eyes always downcast, her shoulders slumped in what they took for grief. They did not see the prisoner hiding in plain sight. How could they? They saw Samuel Miller, the hard-working miner, the grieving widower, a man they had known their whole lives. They could not imagine the monster that lived behind his familiar eyes. And I never spoke a word to contradict them. Fear had stolen my voice. I had become so adept at playing the part of the silent, dutiful Eleanor that I was afraid Abigail no longer knew how to speak. A sound it wasn't sure would ever come again. Hope arrived on a Tuesday. It arrived on a hot, still afternoon in late summer. The kind of day in the mountains where the air is so thick with humidity it feels heavy in your lungs, like you're breathing water. It arrived not with a thunderclap or a chorus of angels, but with the clean, sharp sound of a hammer striking a nail. For several weeks, a crew of men had been working in town. They were building a new annex for the church, a small library and meeting hall. They were outsiders, men from a few counties over, hired for their skill with timber and stone. My father had been complaining about the noise for days. The constant banging, and the whine of the saw disrupting his afternoon stupor. But to me, that noise was a kind of music. It was the sound of creation, of progress. It was a sound from the outside world, a rhythmic, steady reminder that life was happening, things were being built, somewhere beyond the crumbling walls of my prison. It was the sound of something other than silence. That particular afternoon, my father had sent me to the small general store for a sack of flour and a plug of chewing tobacco for himself. It was a rare solo trip, a short leash extended only because the store was just at the edge of our lane and he could, if he chose, watch me from the front porch. I was walking back, my head down as usual, my eyes fixed on the dusty toes of my mother's old boots, the weight of the 20-pound flour sack digging into my shoulder. I was lost in my own gray thoughts when a young man's voice, clear and polite, pulled me out of my trance. "Excuse me, miss? I believe you dropped something." I stopped dead in the middle of the road. Faded red ribbon lying in the dust of the road. It must have come loose from the cuff of my dress, one of my mother's old, simple embellishments, before I could even think to move. He had a clean-shaven, earnest face and kind eyes, the color of warm honey. And he had a gentle smile that held no judgment, no pity, no threat. Only simple politeness. He held the ribbon out to me in the palm of his hand. "Here you go." My own hand trembled as I reached out to take it. The flour sack slipped from my shoulder, and I had to readjust it. Like a language, I had almost forgotten how to speak. They came out small and hoarse. He just smiled again, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. "No problem at all. You have a good day now, miss." He gave a small, respectful nod and turned back toward the sound of the hammers, leaving me standing alone in the road. The entire exchange could not have lasted more than 30 seconds. The simple, respectful kindness of that stranger was like a splash of cold, clean water on a dusty, withered plant I had thought long dead. A tiny, fragile part of me, the part that still remembered being Abigail, began to stir with a tentative, unfamiliar life. For the rest of the short walk home, I clutched that small red ribbon in my fist as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. It was proof. It was tangible evidence that a world still existed where people were simply kind, where a glance didn't hold a threat, where a conversation was just a conversation, where I could just be miss. That tiny, flickering candle of hope was almost extinguished that very night. My father had been on the porch, as I knew he would be. He had seen it all. The moment the kitchen door was closed behind us, he grabbed me, his fingers digging into the arm the boy had not touched. The brief moment of courage I'd felt evaporating like morning mist. The fear was back, cold and familiar. I dropped the ribbon from my dress. He just picked it up for me. That was all. "You're a liar," he roared, his face darkening with that familiar, terrifying alcoholic rage. "I saw you. I saw the way you looked at him. I saw you smiling at him like a common tramp. You think you can shame me? You think you can be a whore right out on the main road for all the world to see?" His accusations were so grotesque, so divorced from the innocent reality of the moment, that I couldn't even form a defense. It was like arguing with a hurricane. He dragged me through the house, past the parlor, to the small, windowless pantry at the back. It was a dark, musty closet where we stored canned goods and potatoes. He threw me inside with such force that I stumbled and fell hard against the rough wooden shelves, sending a jar of my mother's pickled beans crashing to the floor. "You'll stay in here and you'll think about what you are," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You are my Eleanor. You belong to me, and I will not have you making eyes at other men." The heavy wooden door slammed shut, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. He kept me in there. Twice a day, He would unbolt the door just long enough to shove a piece of dry bread and a tin cup of water onto the floor, never speaking a word, before slamming the door and bolting it again. In the disorienting darkness, I lost all track of time. I huddled on the cold floor, the terror and despair washing over me in suffocating waves. He had lit a candle in my soul, and my father was trying with all his might to snuff it out. But I had learned something in those 30 seconds on the road. You cannot unsee the light. You cannot unfeel a moment of kindness. For the first time, I wasn't just vowing to survive for my mother's memory. I was vowing to survive for me. For Abigail. The girl who had been called Miss on a hot summer afternoon. A person worth saving. It was our neighbor, Martha, who found me. Martha was a widow in her late 60s. She lived in the small house just down the road, and she was the only person in our hollow who had never fully accepted my father's tragic story about my inconsolable grief. Over the past few years, on the second day of my confinement in the pantry, she came over with a loaf of her famous zucchini bread, a common neighborly gesture that served as her excuse. When my father told her, found it locked from the outside, and her face, I would later learn, set like stone. She didn't need a key for a simple slide bolt. She went to her own shed, returned with a sturdy iron pry bar, and with a grunt of effort, popped the bolt from its housing. She opened the door, and the light that flooded in was blinding. I was a mess, huddled on the floor like a frightened animal. She simply helped me up, her touch surprisingly gentle for such a tough woman, and guided me to a chair at the kitchen table. She gave me a glass of cool water from her own well, and then, desperate flood of pain and horror that had been locked away in silence for so long. I told her about the night my mother died, about the blue housecoat, about being forced to take my mother's name and her place in his bed. I told her about the burning of my clothes and my books, the constant fear, the beatings. I told her about the kind boy on the road, the red ribbon, and the 2 days I had just spent locked in the dark. Martha sat across from me and listened, her face growing paler and harder with every word I spoke. When I was finally finished, gasping for breath, there was a long silence. She didn't say a word. She just reached across the table, took my trembling hands in her own work-worn ones, and she wept. Her tears were not tears of pity. They were tears of pure, righteous fury. She cried for my mother, her lost friend. She cried for the innocent girl I had been, and she cried for the haunted woman I had been forced to become. Her tears were a baptism. They washed away the suffocating stain of my isolation. Not just prayer. She knew that getting me away from Samuel, a man respected in the community, would require more than just her anger. It would require a careful, methodical plan. And she knew we couldn't do it alone. The first person she brought into our small conspiracy of hope was the young man who had inadvertently started it all. His name was Elijah. Martha, with her practical wisdom, approached him cautiously one evening as he was packing up his tools at the church site. She learned he was from a town near Charleston, a good boy lodging with his aunt while the church job lasted. He was quiet, devout, and hardworking, the kind of young man whose character was as solid as the foundations he laid. Martha, too monstrous for a stranger to hear. She simply told him that I was in a terrible situation at home, that my father was a grieving, abusive alcoholic who had become a tyrant, and that I desperately needed to get away to safety. Elijah listened, his kind, honey-colored eyes etched with a deep concern. He remembered me, he said. He looked at Martha and said the 5 words that changed my life. What can I do to help? And so, the plan began to take shape in hushed, urgent conversations over Martha's kitchen table. Always while my father was at the mines or drowning his sorrows at the saloon. The biggest challenge was twofold. I needed a plausible reason to be out of the house and interacting with the world.
He presented it to Martha.
The men on the crew, he said, we get our clothes filthy every week. We've just been washing them in a bucket as best we can. It's a real chore. What if your niece, Abigail, started a little laundry service for us? It was the perfect cover. Martha officially hired me to help her with her chores. Every Friday afternoon, he would pick up the clean, neatly folded laundry. My father knew about the arrangement. He saw it as harmless women's work that brought a few extra dollars into Martha's house, and by extension, our community. He was a man who believed a woman's place was in service. And this fit his worldview. He didn't know the truth. The money Elijah paid was far more than the work was worth. And tucked deep inside the pocket of a pair of folded overalls each week would be an extra $5 or $10 bill, a fortune to me. Elijah would hand the payment to Martha, and she would carefully set my secret share aside, hiding it for me in an old, dented tea tin in the back of her pantry. It was my freedom fund. For the first time in my life, I was earning my own money. I was earning my escape. Those weeks were the most terrifying and hopeful of my life. We decided the escape had to be on the night of the 4th of July. It was the one night of the year when our small, quiet town allowed itself a little chaos. The annual picnic on the church grounds, followed by a fireworks display down by the river, meant that everyone would be distracted. The noise of the celebration, the crowds of people, the explosions in the sky, it was the perfect camouflage for a desperate flight. Martha, our reluctant general, made the arrangements. Her brother, a quiet, reliable man named Joseph who ran a small hauling business 2 towns over, agreed to be our getaway driver. And his trust in her judgment was absolute. The final days leading up to the 4th were a storm of gut-wrenching anxiety and fragile, fluttering hope. My heart felt like it was living a double life. At home, I continued my performance as the silent, captive Eleanor, enduring my father's brooding presence and his increasingly erratic moods. He seemed to sense a shift in the air, a change in me he couldn't name, but that made him more watchful, more possessive than ever. The night before the 4th, as I was serving him his supper, he grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. He stared at me with those haunted eyes and said, "You're all I have left in this world, Eleanor. Don't you ever forget that." It was not a statement of love. It was the threat of a king to his possession. But for the few hours each week I spent at Martha's house, scrubbing those work clothes in a large wash basin in her secluded backyard, I was Abigail. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and barbecue smoke. Martha, playing her part beautifully, had invited my father over to her porch for a slice of her patriotic firecracker cake and a cup of coffee before they walked down to watch the fireworks. It was a time-honored neighborly tradition, and he accepted without suspicion. But this year, the coffee she served him was laced with 2 of the strong sleeping powders she'd gotten from the doctor for her insomnia. While he sat in her parlor, slowly growing drowsy in the summer heat, I was supposed to slip out my bedroom window, run through the dark stretch of woods that separated our properties, and meet Martha. She would then drive me in her own car to the bridge where her brother was waiting. But the devil, as they say, is always in the details, and he had one last trick to play. My father, in his heightened state of suspicion, did something he had never done before. Before he walked over to Martha's house, he came to my room. He told me he didn't want me wandering about while he was gone. And then he locked my bedroom door from the outside. I heard the click of the key in the old lock. Then, just to be certain, he locked the main front and back doors of the house and took the single skeleton key that opened all of them with him. When I heard that final lock click, a cold, sickening panic seized me. I was trapped. It was over. All our planning, all our whispered hopes, all the money in the tea tin, it was for nothing. He had outsmarted us. But inside my locked room, the only sound was the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart against my ribs. I was a prisoner in a cage within a cage. I sank onto the floor. The rough would cool against my cheek, and for a few desperate moments, I let despair win. He had won. He would always win. But then, through the wall, I heard the slow, deliberate chime of the grandfather clock in the hall. It chimed 9 times, then once more for the half hour. 9:30. Only 30 minutes until Joseph would be waiting at the bridge. 30 minutes until he would give up and leave. The thought of Elijah's kind eyes, of Martha's fierce loyalty, of my mother's dying wish, it was a spark in the suffocating darkness. I would not give up.
Not now.
Not this close. I scrambled to the window. It was an old sash window, and it hadn't been opened in a decade. I threw my shoulder against the frame, again and again, rattling it uselessly. It was as solid as the wall. He had thought of everything. Just as a hot tear of pure frustration and fury slipped down my cheek, I heard a sound. A faint scratching sound at my bedroom door. It was not the sound of a key. It was something else. "Abigail?" A voice whispered urgently from the other side. "Abigail, it's me. Elijah." Hope surged through me so powerfully it felt like an electric shock. He had come. He was here. Martha must have realized something was terribly wrong when I didn't show up at her house. He had come back for me. "I'm here," I whispered back, my voice choked with a desperate relief. He locked me in. "The key is gone." "Stand back from the door," he said, his voice miraculously calm and steady, a rock in my sea of panic. I scurried to the far corner of the room. I heard a metallic scraping sound, then a soft click, and then the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life, the sound of the bolt sliding open. Elijah slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. In his hand, he held a thin piece of metal, a lockpick he'd fashioned from a piece of baling wire. There was no time for words. He just grabbed my hand, his grip firm and reassuring, where he was hopefully sinking into a drugged sleep. Just then, the first official firework of the main display boomed in the distance, a deep concussion that vibrated through the floorboards. The old wood groaned in protest. Another firework, a crackling cascade of sound, exploded outside. He hit it again, harder this time. There was a sharp, splintering crack, and the door flew open. The frame shattered and broken. We did not hesitate. We ran. We flew out into the warm, humid night, my bare feet pounding silently against the cool, damp earth of the path. The air was alive. I saw a sight that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. My father was standing in the middle of the road, a figure of pure, terrifying rage. And, in his hands, glinting in the colored light, he was holding his hunting rifle. "Go faster, Martha," Elijah yelled. Martha already had the pedal to the floor. The old car rattled and shook. He was shooting at his own daughter. Any last, lingering, microscopic shred of the man I once called my father died in that moment, killed by that sound. Another crack, louder this time. The tires squealing in protest, and saw the dark shape of the bridge ahead. The headlights of a truck flashed twice. It was Joseph. Martha pulled up alongside it, and Elijah threw my door open. "Go, Abigail."
Go now.
"Get in." I scrambled out of the car and into the passenger seat of the truck. Joseph didn't even wait for me to close the door before he slammed the truck into gear. The big vehicle leaped forward onto the bridge and into the welcoming darkness of the open road, leaving my old life, my prison, behind me forever. As we sped away, I looked back one last time. Martha had turned her car sideways, blocking the road, her headlights shining like two defiant eyes back at the monster we had left behind in the dark. The journey to Pittsburgh was a strange dream, a passage from one life to another. I remember the constant, deep rumble of the truck's engine, a reassuring sound that was pulling me further and further away from the nightmare. I remember watching the hypnotic pattern of the white lines on the highway, appearing and disappearing under the headlights, each one a stitch sewing my old life shut. Martha's brother, Joseph, was a kind and quiet man who understood that I needed silence more than conversation. He wrapped a thick wool blanket around my shoulders, handed me a thermos of hot, sweet coffee, and those small, simple comforts felt like the greatest luxuries in the world. I arrived in the city of Pittsburgh in the gray, misty hours of the early morning on July 5th, 1968. As we drove through the sleeping streets, I stared in absolute awe at the towering buildings, the electric streetlights that cast pools of yellow on the wet pavement, the sheer, overwhelming scale of it all. After a life lived in a tiny hollow, it felt like landing on another planet. Joseph took me to the home of his sister, Teresa, who was also Martha's younger sister. She lived in a small, tidy row house in a neighborhood filled with the families of the men who worked the steel mills, the air tinged with the faint, metallic scent of industry. Teresa was a warm, bustling woman with a no-nonsense attitude and a heart as big and open as her sister's. She took one look at my thin frame, my borrowed dress, and the raw terror that was still wide in my eyes. She didn't press me with questions or demand the sordid details. She understood enough. She gave me a small, clean room at the top of the stairs, a hot meal of soup and bread, and a soft, fresh nightgown. That night, for the first time in 3 years, I slept in a bed that held no fear. I slept a deep, dreamless, exhausted sleep. I was terrified of my own liberty. The city was so loud, a constant, roaring cacophony of traffic, sirens, and the shouts of unseen people. After years of forced silence, but Teresa, like her sister, was patient and wise. She started small. She'd ask me to walk with her to the corner market, then to the post office a few blocks away. Slowly, Teresa helped me navigate the bureaucracy to apply for a new birth certificate and a social security card. The day I held the small, laminated card in my hand, the card that read Abigail Miller, I cried. It felt like a resurrection. I enrolled in night classes at the local high school to finally get my diploma. The first time I sat in a classroom, held a pen in my hand, and opened a clean, I found work as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in one of the nicer neighborhoods, scrubbing floors and washing laundry. But this time, the work felt entirely different. It was my choice. And the money I earned, handed to me in a crisp envelope each Friday, was my own. I saved every penny I could. Eventually, I got a better job as a sales clerk in a large downtown fabric store. It was a world of vibrant color and rich texture, a world of creation that felt a million miles away from the gray, decaying world of my past. During these first months of my new life, he told me that my father had been arrested the day after the 4th of July, after Martha, true to her word, went to the sheriff and reported him for shooting at her car. But this was our small town, and Samuel Miller was a known quantity. He spun a story about being drunk and confused, thinking there were prowlers on his property. They held him in the county jail for a few days for reckless endangerment, and then they let him go with a stern warning and a small fine. The news sent a cold chill down my spine, a potent reminder that the monster I had fled was still out there, and he was free. The second letter came about 6 months later, in the cold of winter. This one was full of hope. The church annex was finally finished, and his job in our town was done. He was going home to Charleston for a few weeks to visit his ailing mother, and then he wrote the words I had been praying to read. He was coming to Pittsburgh. He had saved some money. He wanted to see me. He wanted to see if the small spark we both felt could, with time and care, become a steady flame. My heart soared with a joy so intense it felt like it might burst. I wrote back immediately, my hand trembling, pouring out all my hopes for our future onto the cheap stationery. I waited, and I waited, but that was the last letter I ever received. He never came. For months, I existed in a painful, agonizing limbo, checking the mail every day, my hope slowly souring into a familiar, aching dread. There was no news.
No explanation.
Just a vast, haunting silence. Years later, long after I had accepted he was gone, after I was married and had children of my own, my daughter Laura, who was a whiz with that new invention called the internet, helped me search for answers. Had skidded on an icy patch of mountain road and had gone into a ravine. There were no survivors. His name was not on the partial list of victims published in the article, but the timing. It seemed God had given me a guardian angel to see me out of hell, and then he had called that angel home. Life, however, does not wait for you to heal. It insists on moving forward. In 1975, I told him a heavily sanitized version of my past, that I had left home because of a difficult and abusive family situation. He was a man who understood that some doors are best left unopened. All the music my mother had put inside me, into them. Our small home was filled with laughter, with books, and with the warm smell of fresh-baked bread. I had a life I had never believed possible. But even in the brightest daylight of my new happiness, a shadow lingered. The fear of my father, the fear of the past reaching out its long arms to reclaim me, was a cold, hard knot that never fully dissolved in the pit of my stomach. The past came for me in the spring of 1980. It arrived in a plain white envelope with Martha's familiar, spidery handwriting on it. It had been nearly 12 years since my escape. Her letter was short and filled with a frantic urgency. My father's health had finally failed him, black lung from his years in the mines. He had sold our old house, and with a kind of crazed, dying obsession, had begun telling the few people he still spoke to that he was going to find his Eleanor. He was going to find his wife. Martha had heard from a cousin that he was asking about people who had moved to Pittsburgh.
He was looking for me.
The letter terrified me, but a part of my rational mind thought, his body stooped and broken by disease, his face a ravaged mask of age and sickness. But the eyes were the same. They were filled with that same unholy, possessive fire. He started screaming my mother's name. Eleanor, I know you're in there, you bitch. Come out, Eleanor. I've come for you. My blood ran cold. My children were inside playing. My husband, David. The police would pick him up for vagrancy or disturbing the peace, and he'd be released a few hours later. He was just a sick, confused old man, they said. He wasn't a real threat, but I knew he was. He was a threat to my peace, to my sanity, to the world I had so carefully and painfully built. The final confrontation happened on a Saturday morning. He came right up onto our porch, pounding on the door with his bony fists, his voice a hoarse, ragged cry. Eleanor, you ungrateful whore. After all I did for you, you left me. You will not abandon me again. David stood between him and the door, his body a shield, telling him firmly to leave our property. That was the moment the fear that had ruled my life for so long finally broke. It shattered, and what rushed into the void was a cold, hard, clarifying anger. It was the anger of the 15-year-old girl he had violated in the dark. Stood before him, looked him straight in his wild eyes, and said, in a voice that was low and clear and did not tremble, My name is Abigail, and you will not hurt my family. Not ever again. I went to the Central Police Station that afternoon. I asked to speak to a detective, and this time, sitting in a small, sterile room, I told the whole truth. I told them everything. The name he had stolen from me. I showed them the scars on my soul. They listened. This time, they finally, truly listened. They arrested him that evening and held him without bail, pending a full investigation into crimes that were decades old but had no statute of limitations on their horror. 2 days later, a plainclothes detective came to my house. He and his partner stood awkwardly in my living room. He told me that my father, Samuel Miller, had been found in his jail cell that morning. He had used his own belt to hang himself from a bar on the cell door. He was dead. When the detectives left, a silence fell over our small living room. A quiet so profound it felt louder than the shouting had been. David, my dear, gentle husband, put his arm around me. My children, old enough to understand that something terrible had happened but too young to grasp its shape, looked at us with wide, worried eyes. I expected to feel something. A surge of triumphant joy. A wave of profound relief. A sense of righteous victory. That justice, however twisted and delayed, had finally been done. Hollow emptiness. The monster was dead. The warden was gone. But his death didn't heal the wounds he had carved into my soul. The chains had been struck off, but my wrists still felt their phantom weight. The final confrontation I had spent years dreading and preparing for had never happened. He had denied me even that. He had simply exited the stage, leaving me alone with the ruins he had made. A few days later, a call came from the county coroner's office in West Virginia. They had found my name, my married name, Abigail, as his next of kin in a worn wallet. They asked what I wanted to do about the body. There would be no service, they assumed, but it needed to be interred. I listened to the man's bureaucratic voice on the other end of the line, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just a distant, clinical coldness. Not for his burial, not ever. The The past was another country, a dark and haunted place I had no desire to visit again. The girl he had tried to destroy did not live there anymore. It was there in the nightmares that still came, less frequently, but with the same chilling clarity. It was there in my fierce, almost suffocating need to protect my own children. A primal fear that the world was filled with monsters hiding behind familiar faces. But slowly, day by day, year by year, the life I had built with David began to push the ghost out. The sound of my children's laughter echoing in the small backyard was real. The feeling of David's hand holding mine as we sat on the porch in the evening was real. These things were solid. They were present. The past was a shadow, and shadows cannot survive in a house filled with light. My David, my good man, he passed away from a heart attack 10 years ago. We had 40 beautiful years together. He gave me a life of peace and steadfast love, a safe harbor I had never thought I would find. And my children, Mariano and Laura, are grown now. A life overflowing with a love that is gentle and real and true. And I have learned that this is the greatest revenge. My survival, my happiness, my peace, these are things my father, in his dark and twisted heart, could never have imagined for me. His ultimate power was the power to destroy, and I had refused to be destroyed. I had chosen to build instead. So, why do I tell this story now? In the twilight of my years, sitting here in the comfortable quiet of the home I have lived in for most of my life, I tell it not to reopen old wounds, whose belief in me was a seed of strength that even he could not kill. I tell it for Martha, whose righteous anger and fierce courage were the hands that pried open my cage. I tell it for Elijah, and I tell it for you. Perhaps you who are listening to my voice are living in your own kind of hell today. Maybe your prison doesn't have a locked door, but is made of fear or loneliness, or a past you feel you cannot escape. I am here to tell you, as a woman who has walked through the valley of the shadow of death, that survival is possible. A new beginning is possible. Peace is possible, but it does not come from the outside. The death of my father did not set me free. My freedom began the moment I decided to fight back. It began with the whisper of a promise to my mother. It grew with the secret joy of a red ribbon clutched in my fist. It was born in the desperate flight down a dark road on the 4th of July. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. I learned that God is with you, but he is with you in the courage he plants in your own heart and in the faces of the Marthas and Elijahs he sends to walk beside you. They are a map of where you have been. They are a sign that you are stronger than whatever it was that tried to hurt you. So look around in your own life. Who is drowning in silence? A single whisper of hope is all it takes to help someone find the strength to break their own chains. My name is Abigail. I am 73 years old, and I have learned that hell is a house full of secrets and fear. But heaven is a home you build yourself, filled with love and forgiveness and the quiet joy of a life lived in the light.